Trump says the ceasefire still holds. Iran says the United States violated it first. Washington says its warships came under attack. Tehran says American forces struck civilian areas. And while both sides continue talking about peace, missiles are still flying across the Strait of Hormuz. So what is actually happening? And more importantly, who's telling the truth? Let's start with the basics, because even the basics are contested. Somewhere in the waters between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, American destroyers are currently patrolling. Those ships are armed, their crews are on high alert, and depending on which government briefing you read, they are either defending themselves from ongoing Iranian aggression, or they are the aggressor. That's where we are. That's how this story begins. According to the United States military, Iranian missiles, drones, and fast attack boats have targeted American naval assets in the region. These are not disputed incidents buried in footnotes. These are official claims, made by officials, backed by press releases, carried by Reuters, the Associated Press, and every major Western outlet. But then Iran speaks, and Tehran's version sounds like it was written in a parallel universe. Iranian state media describes American forces striking coastal positions, civilian-linked infrastructure, areas that, according to Tehran, had nothing to do with any military operation. Two governments, two sets of facts, one conflict. And here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. Both sides are simultaneously calling this a ceasefire. Trump has said, publicly and repeatedly, that the ceasefire still holds. His language has been confident, authoritative, the kind of language designed to signal control over a situation. Iran's position is different. Tehran says the United States violated the ceasefire first, that American actions broke whatever fragile agreement existed, that Iran is not escalating. Iran is responding, and so we have a ceasefire where both sides accuse the other of breaking it, while both sides claim they are the one acting defensively, and while weapons continue to move through the air and across the water. Call it what you want. It doesn't feel like peace. But here's the problem. The word ceasefire carries enormous psychological weight. It tells markets to stabilize. It tells populations to breathe. It tells the international community that the adults are in the room and that someone somewhere is managing the situation. When Trump says the ceasefire holds, he is not just making a military statement. He is making a reality statement. He is shaping the narrative before anyone else can. And when Iran contradicts that narrative, it isn't just disputing facts. It is fighting for control of the story itself. Because in modern geopolitical conflict, controlling the story is almost as important as controlling the battlefield. Think about what each side needs right now. The United States needs to project confidence. It needs oil markets to stay below the threshold of panic. It needs its allies in the Gulf to stay calm. It needs the American public to believe that its military is operating from a position of strength, not reaction. Iran needs something different. Iran needs to demonstrate to its own population, to its regional allies, and to any watching adversaries that it has not been broken, that American military pressure has not forced Tehran to its knees, that Iran retains both the will and the capability to respond. Both of these needs are real. Both of these needs are politically necessary, and both of these needs are completely incompatible with a shared version of reality, which is why the truth in this conflict may be the first real casualty. Now let's talk about the geography, because the geography is what makes all of this terrifying on a global scale. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. That's the distance between safety and catastrophe for a significant portion of the world's energy supply. More than 20% of all the oil traded globally passes through that strait every single day. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar all funnel through that corridor. They carry the fuel that powers factories in Germany, lights hospitals in South Korea, moves cargo across the American Midwest. When something happens in the Strait of Hormuz, it doesn't stay in the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, global shipping is under direct threat. Reports indicate thousands of sailors are stranded or operating under severe restrictions. Commercial vessels are rerouting. Insurance costs for shipping through the region have spiked in ways not seen in years, and the oil markets have already reacted sharply. When missile exchanges happen near the world's most critical energy corridor, traders don't wait for the full picture. They respond to the possibility of disruption, and that possibility is now very, very real. The economic consequences ripple outward faster than any military deployment. By the time a warship repositions, a barrel of oil has already moved $10 in either direction. Inflation projections have already shifted in finance ministries from London to Tokyo, and ordinary people who have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz and never will are already beginning to feel it at the pump. This is what makes this crisis different from a regional dispute. It stopped being regional the moment it touched that strait. What happened next surprised almost everyone. The UAE, a Gulf state that has spent years building relationships with both Washington and Tehran, activated its air defense systems. Interceptions were reported. The details remain murky, but the signal was clear. When a country like the UAE starts shooting things out of the sky The situation has moved beyond the diplomatic stage. The tension has spread, and neighboring states are no longer passive observers. They are participants, whether they intended to be or not. Lebanon, meanwhile, is watching all of this with its own set of anxieties. Tensions there have not subsided. The region is not a collection of separate crises. It is a single, interconnected system where pressure in one place translates into pressure everywhere else. And sitting above all of this, issuing statements and warnings, is Donald Trump. He described earlier American strikes as a love tap. That specific phrase landed like a stone into still water because it communicated something very deliberate. It signaled we have been restrained. It signaled we could do far more. It signaled the next round will not be described with that kind of language. But it also communicated something unintentional. It showed the world how America currently frames its use of military force, casually, confidently, with an undertone of threat wrapped inside apparent nonchalance. Iran heard that phrase. The Gulf states heard that phrase. China heard that phrase. Russia heard that phrase. And every single one of them interpreted it differently. Most people will completely disagree on what's actually happening here. That is not a failure of journalism. That is not because the facts are hidden. It is because two parallel information ecosystems have been running simultaneously, and they have almost no overlap. CNN and BBC are reporting one version. Al Jazeera is reporting another. Iranian state media is operating in a completely different register, and American defense briefings are calibrated to tell a specific story to a specific audience. None of these outlets are simply lying. But none of them are giving you the full picture either, because nobody has the full picture, and the people who do have it are the ones with the greatest incentive to distort it. This is what information warfare actually looks like. Not crude propaganda posters, not obvious fabrications, but the deliberate, sophisticated management of competing realities, where each side releases just enough verifiable truth to make their version of events seem credible, while burying the parts that complicate the narrative. Both the United States and Iran are telling you they are acting defensively. Both are telling you they do not want escalation. Both are warning that things could get significantly worse if the other side continues. Two countries, both defensive, both reluctant, both warning of escalation. And yet missiles are still in the air. The logic doesn't hold together. But that's precisely the point. When logic stops holding together in public discourse during a crisis, it is usually because someone needs it not to. But then the story became even stranger. While all of this was happening, while destroyers were maneuvering and missiles were being intercepted and oil prices were lurching, peace negotiations were also continuing. Active negotiations, real ones, with actual mediators. Pakistan has entered this picture as an intermediary between Washington and Tehran. China is quietly involved at the diplomatic level. Back-channel communications are apparently open, and both sides, despite everything, have not formally walked away from the table. Let that sit for a moment. Weapons are being fired. Navies are in contested waters, and diplomats are still meeting. This is not contradiction. This is the new architecture of modern conflict, because neither side actually wants total war. Total war would be catastrophic for both. Iran knows that a full American military campaign would be existential. Washington knows that a full war in the Persian Gulf would send oil to $150 a barrel, shatter any remaining economic stability, and consume whatever political capital remains. So instead, both sides are doing something far more sophisticated and far more dangerous. They are managing escalation, not stopping it, managing it, calibrating how much pressure to apply, how much force to use, how much to threaten, without triggering the response that neither side actually wants. It is a game of margins. And the margins right now are terrifyingly thin. Maybe this is the real future of modern conflict. Not peace, not total war, but permanent instability, where the space between diplomacy and destruction becomes the new normal, and where both sides learn to operate indefinitely inside that space. And if that's true, the implications extend far beyond this particular crisis. Think about what that means for global markets, for energy security, for the supply chains that underpin modern life. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes a permanent zone of managed tension, if every week there is a new incident, a new claim, a new counterclaim, then the entire world economy is operating on a permanent knife edge. Insurance premiums stay elevated. Shipping routes remain disrupted. Energy prices carry a permanent instability premium. And the cost of that instability is absorbed slowly and invisibly by the people furthest from the conflict. Not by governments, not by defense contractors, not by geopolitical strategists writing papers in Washington think tanks, by ordinary people, paying more for fuel, paying more for food that was transported by vehicles running on that fuel, paying more for goods manufactured in economies destabilized by energy costs. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide, but its shadow stretches across the entire world. Now let's talk about the part of this story that almost nobody is discussing, because it might actually be the most important part. China is present, quietly, diplomatically. But present, Beijing has strategic, economic, and energy interests in this region that are enormous. China imports massive quantities of oil from the Persian Gulf. Any serious disruption to those flows is not just an economic inconvenience for Beijing, it is a strategic threat. But China is also watching something else, something bigger. It is watching how the United States manages a crisis of this complexity. It is watching whether American military presence in the region translates into effective political outcomes. It is watching whether allies stay aligned, whether threats carry weight, whether diplomatic frameworks hold. It is taking notes. And Pakistan's role as a mediator is not accidental either. Islamabad has relationships with both Washington and Tehran. It has its own strategic interest in regional stability, and its involvement signals that the United States is not managing this crisis alone through raw military power the way it might have in an earlier era. It needs intermediaries. It needs diplomatic architecture. It needs partners to carry messages that it cannot deliver directly. That is not necessarily a sign of weakness, but it is a different kind of power than the world was accustomed to seeing from Washington. The Gulf states, meanwhile, are watching all of this with a very particular kind of anxiety. They live in this region. They cannot relocate their oil fields. They cannot move their populations beyond the blast radius of regional conflict. And they have spent years trying to hedge between American security guarantees and the reality of Iranian regional influence. That balancing act is becoming harder. The margins are shrinking. And some of them are beginning to wonder quietly whether the certainties they built their security frameworks upon are as solid as they once seemed. Which brings us to the most dangerous possibility of all. What if conflicts like this one never fully resolve anymore? What if the ceasefire that isn't a ceasefire becomes a template, a recurring pattern, a structure that both sides find tolerable enough to sustain indefinitely? Because the alternative, either genuine peace or genuine war, requires concessions that neither side is willing to make. We have seen this pattern before, in different regions, in different forms. Conflicts that technically ended, but never actually stopped. Borders that are technically peaceful, but permanently militarized. Agreements that exist on paper, but not in practice. What this crisis may be showing us is that modern great power competition has developed a new mode of operation, one where the goal is not victory, not resolution, not even stability. In the traditional sense, the goal is controlled ambiguity, the maintenance of a situation that is unstable enough to preserve leverage, but not so unstable that it triggers consequences nobody wants. And within that controlled ambiguity, truth becomes a tool, narrative becomes a weapon, reality becomes negotiable. This is what makes this moment genuinely deeply unsettling. Not the missiles. The missiles are visible. They can be tracked, intercepted, reported. What cannot be easily tracked or intercepted is the erosion of shared reality, the slow, systematic dismantling of the idea that there is a set of facts that both sides acknowledge, that there is a common ground of truth from which disagreement can begin. When that common ground disappears and both sides retreat into their own verified, official, media-supported version of events, the space for diplomacy shrinks. The space for miscalculation grows. And miscalculation is how conflicts that nobody wanted become conflicts that nobody can stop. So where does this leave us? Trump says the ceasefire holds. Iran says the ceasefire was broken before it could hold. The destroyers are still there. The negotiations are still happening. The missiles are still flying. And the oil is still moving through a 21-mile corridor that the entire global economy depends upon. Pakistan is making calls. China is making calculations. Gulf states are making decisions about which version of this story to believe, and media organizations on 4 continents are presenting 4 different versions of the same events. There is no clean ending to this analysis, because there is no clean ending to this story. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. What we can say is this. Something is happening in the waters around the Strait of Hormuz that cannot be fully explained by the official statements of either government. Something is happening in the relationship between diplomacy and military force that does not fit the old frameworks of peace and war. And something is happening to the nature of truth in modern geopolitical conflict that should concern anyone who believes that shared facts are the foundation of any stable international order. The question this crisis raises is not simply who fired first, or whose ceasefire is real. The deeper question is this. In a world where 2 nuclear-adjacent powers can simultaneously conduct military operations and peace negotiations, where both can claim restraint while demonstrating force, where both can shape their own version of events for their own audience, and where the global media ecosystem amplifies both versions without resolution, how do you know what's real? How does anyone? The missiles know where they're going. The sailors on those destroyers know what they're experiencing. The civilians near the coastal areas know what landed near them. But the story of what this all means, the narrative that will shape policy, public opinion, and the decisions of the next 6 months, that story is still being written by people who have very specific reasons to write it a certain way. And none of them are going to tell you that. Trump says it's peace. Iran says it's war. And somewhere in the water between those two versions of reality, the world is waiting to find out which one was right, if it ever does.